Oh, it is week 11 waiver wire time, and we're going to talk about 17 different players here in less than 20 minutes. Stick around all the way to the end because Dr. Vignesh Doraiswamy is going to analyze all the major injuries from the week 10 action. Big names, guys like Cooper Kupp, Zach Ertz, and what we're going to do with them. I'm Alfredo Brown. I'm here with Dr. Vignesh Doraiswamy. Vig, I'm wearing my Batman shirt today, and I got all my Batman stuff out in honor of the late Kevin Conroy. For those of you who don't know, he passed away this past weekend, and that's the voice actor that played Batman for decades in the animated series and the video games. So RIP, Kevin Conroy. Before we get into today's action, okay, I want to remind everybody, if you're watching on YouTube, just go hit the like and subscribe button. Just click that bell. Drop your week 11 questions in the comments below. I'm going to get back to every single one of them. Vig, this is a kind of sneaky waiver wire week with some fancy names at the forefront. And Rachaad White seems to be the name that is in the front of all of this. Everyone seems to be talking about Rachaad White, but it also seems like he's not really available in competitive leagues. I don't quite get it. The World Wide Web, also known as the internet, says that he's available in 60 to 75% of leagues. And then everyone on elonmusk.com, also known as Twitter, says he's not available. Like he's not anywhere. So this is going to be an interesting guy to talk about because I don't think this is really more of a waiver wire guy. It's more of a what do we do with him now kind of guy. So Vig, I don't know how excited I really am about Rachaad White. I think we might need to hold our horses a little bit.
Yeah, you can't talk about Rachaad White without talking about Leonard Fournette, right? Leonard Fournette led the Bucs among the running backs, at least with 13 opportunities, a combination of his carries and targets in the first half. And then obviously he left with his hip injury. It looked really painful, but it just sounds like a really bad bruise, no structural damage. They're talking like, is this a hip pointer? Maybe 1 to 2 weeks where he might be out. But if you look at the schedule for those next 1 to 2 weeks, next week is a bye, allowing Fournette to sort of recover and recuperate. And then they play Cleveland and New Orleans. So maybe there's a nice game against Cleveland coming in for White if Fournette is out. But beyond that, you got to believe that Fournette's probably going to come back and take the lion's share of the opportunities again.
Yeah, it's one of those things, right? With Rachaad White, the backfield split was a 55-45 split before the injury. And I don't really know that there's a scenario where this is the guy that completely takes over the backfield if Fournette is healthy, right? Like this is a team that's had success with Leonard Fournette. And I don't know how often we actually see legitimately 2 fantasy starting running backs on the same team. And when I say starting running backs, I mean top 24 at their position. I took a look at some of the cases throughout the league, right? Like teams that we've seen, okay, maybe 2 running backs that it could work. Dallas with Zeke and Pollard, Green Bay with Jones and Dillon, Detroit with DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams, Chicago, they've been a really good running team with Montgomery and Herbert, and then Cleveland with Chubb and Hunt. And that seems to be probably the best case right there with Chubb and Hunt. But I looked through these 5 different teams, 10 players, and the amount of times where both running backs simultaneously were top 24 in the same week was just 19.5% of the time. So you're talking about less than once every 5 games where these players are actually both startable in fantasy football. But then when you kind of temper the expectations and you make a top 36 thing, right? Can they be an RB3? Can they be a flex? That was more like 51% of the time. So regardless of how you want to slice this and cut it, whatever, for these Tampa Bay running backs, it's still pretty much kind of a Russian roulette type thing. I don't know how really excited I am about Rachaad White going forward. I think that he does, like you said, Vig, have that potential for that 1 week where he can be really good. But none of those teams that I mentioned before have the same kind of passing attack as the Tampa Bay Buccaneers with Chris Godwin and Mike Evans and Julio Jones. And this really isn't something where I know that I'm going to start Rachaad White confidently each week. He's averaged less than 4 yards per carry this season. The Bucs offensive line is bad. And they've got one of the top 5 toughest schedules remaining for the running back position. So I don't know that you're getting a locked and loaded running back with Rachaad White, but I think with the proper expectations, you maybe get 1 good week out of him. And I think that you also, you have yourself a decent RB3 flex player, but I wouldn't, go too crazy. Now, Vig, let's get into our waiver wire ads. You're going to kick us off with our first player.
Yeah, our first player is Kadarius Tony. Yeah, I hear you probably already have him in your league, but he's only rostered in roughly half of leagues. And a lot of people who listen to our show maybe aren't on fantasy Twitter all the time and trying to grab everybody. So, but here's the not good part. He still didn't really play like an overwhelming amount. He was outsnapped by Justin Watson, of all people, 46-28. But what looked good is when he was there, he was targeted on nearly a third of his routes. He got this little touchdown. He's being used a little bit in the running game, and he looked overall, just the eye test, pretty impressive when he was playing out on the field, which hurt me to see because it was against my Jags. But the Chiefs also, look at the context, had a few players that sort of left the field, right? Juju's out, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, McCole Hardman was already out. So Toney, it's hard to know what he's going to be. We know he has the talent. We know he's no longer injured. And he's probably worth a stash if he's still out there. And depending on how everything else shakes out and what some of these injuries are, he may really elevate himself to a pretty important part of that offense.
Another guy who's very similar to Toney in that he's just incredibly athletic, has some good draft capital, and he's on a team where we're just hoping that the breakout happens. And it's Christian Watson, the wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers. And, he's another guy that saw the benefit of other pass catchers being off the field. It was no Romeo Doubs, no Randall Cobb. And he got to play the most snaps of his career, over 80% of the snaps in this game. And, he had a bad drop. And then things just turned in such a 180 where he finishes the game with 4 catches and 3 touchdowns. He really has himself an opportunity here to just establish as not only just a starting wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers, but potentially even the wide receiver 1 for this team because of his athletic ability, because he is this guy that is 6'5" and runs a 4.3 40, and he's that downfield playmaker that Aaron Rodgers so desperately wants. Now, the Packers also have the 8th easiest strength of schedule for wide receivers in the fantasy playoffs. So even though he may not provide you all that value right now, over the next coming weeks, Christian Watson could become a guy that is just getting a little bit better each week so that by the time you get into your fantasy playoffs, he's a guy that could absolutely be winning you your weeks. So not only do I think he's a good waiver wire grab for this week, but he's a good stash going forward.
People have been waiting for Kmet to break out for as long as I can remember it. And the dude has scored 5 touchdowns in 3 weeks. Now, yes, typically we teach you not to chase touchdowns, but the tight end position is a little different where a floor may not be you don't have a safe or reliable floor for like most tight ends not named, Travis Kelce. You kind of do want to chase touchdowns here. He's had over a 90% snap share since week 3. And over the last 2 weeks, he has been the tight end 2 and 1. And obviously that comes off, the back of 4 touchdowns. But his target per route run percentage has more than doubled over the last 2 weeks. And what does doubled mean in this case? Going from 10 to 26. So like 1 in every 4 times he's running out there on a route, a ball's getting thrown his way. He's kind of hitting all the metrics we want to see from that breakout tight end, the snaps, the targets, this insane touchdown rate. And over the next 2 weeks, he's playing against the Atlanta Falcons and the New York Jets, which are very juicy, easy matchups for Kmet. But at the same time, the Chicago wide receivers have tougher remaining strength of schedule. They're going to be covered by great cornerbacks, meaning this running, fleeing Justin Fields is going to be looking to Kmet potentially a lot more, at least this like insane amount that he is looking to him over the last few weeks.
We've talked about a lot of these names before, and another name that we've mentioned actually just 2 weeks ago was Donovan Peoples-Jones, wide receiver for the Cleveland Browns. And listen, he's had double-digit fantasy points or been a top 34 wide receiver or better in 5 of his last 6 games. So it's a player, 11.2 PPR points over that time span, same as Christian Kirk, more than Garrett Wilson, more than Curtis Samuel, nearly the same as Michael Pittman. He's in that same arena with these players. Yet we still don't think of him that way. And I wonder if it's just because he's on the Browns, is it Jacoby Brissett, whatever it is, because how long does it take for us to finally respect what a guy is doing? He's such a low risk kind of guy to pick up. You're not going to have to spend a lot of money on him from your fab. You're probably not even having to burn a waiver priority on him because he may even make it through waivers. But this is a guy that if we've been talking about him for so long and he's still available, it seems like a really easy pickup. He's basically a wide receiver 3 or flex play every week for you. And then the return of Deshaun Watson could actually be huge for him. Remember, Deshaun Watson had such good success with Will Fuller, another guy who is a downfield threat, just like Donovan Peoples-Jones. And mind you, they have the 3rd easiest strength of schedule for wide receivers in the fantasy playoffs. So Donovan Peoples-Jones becomes a really low-cost guy that can actually just give you some consistency on your team with the nice ceiling, high potential, deep plays that you want out of a waiver wire pickup.
The next guy who, again, passes the eye test and was like always impressive athletic, Nico Collins. As I mentioned earlier, impressive athletically, but now it is actually showing up on the field. He leads all Houston wide receivers in snaps and target. He had 10 in the last game. He's had 10 or more PPR points in 3 of the last 4 games played. We know that Cooks is a little disgruntled, Brandon Cooks, that is. So, depending on what happens with Brandon Cooks, Nico Collins may have a much bigger role. He's already showing he can handle the load. And the Houston Texans just have the 11th easiest remaining strength of schedules for fantasy wide receivers. So he is just a great sort of waiver wire pickup. Again, someone who you might not need to spend anything on because people aren't necessarily like in love with the idea of taking a risk on him. But here's what I think you get with him. I think you get a very boom bust wide receiver 3 flex play pretty much every week. Play the matchups a little bit, but Nico Collins can really potentially be that guy who gets you that, 10 to 15 point range in any given week.
Jalen Warren, running back for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's been a top 30 running back in his last 2 games. And on the surface, that doesn't sound all that impressive, right? 10 or more PPR points in those last 2 games. And the snap share continues to look good. 43% of the running back snaps last game, 75% of the passing down work, but now 36% of the early down work, half of the goal line carries. He's really integrating into this Pittsburgh Steelers offense. And you don't find that all that often. And I think that it's kind of like the magic trick, right? Like where everyone is looking one direction while something cool is happening over here. And I think a lot of people are going to be really, really focused on Rachaad White this week, that they're going to forget about a guy like Jalen Warren, who, I get it, the offense isn't nearly as good, but there's potential here for a lot of the same workload for a player that's actually shown that he's been quite talented being on the field. Rachaad White hasn't quite shown as much, but for a guy that, if there's a good like 1B in this scenario that gives you opportunity for an RB3 with some upside as a handcuff, it's going to be Jalen Warren, running back for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's a really good stash if something does happen to Najee Harris. And remember, there's always that chance that Pittsburgh could just be so out of it that they decide to just shut Najee Harris down, let him heal up, and Jalen Warren becomes a guy that could be really big down the stretch for you.
Speaking about someone who definitely needs time to heal, Darren Waller is out on injured reserve and is out for at least 3 or more games. So our next player is Foster Moreau, another tight end to add, especially if you miss on sort of Cole Kmet, or if you're in a league where people are sort of hoarding tight ends. If you're in a short bench, it looks like Zach Ertz is out for a little bit too. It looks like tight ends are sort of going to be a high priority waiver wire ad. So Foster Moreau's had 5 targets or a touchdown over his last 4 games. He's also in 96% of the snaps or better in each of the last 4 games. What does that mean? They are not just using him on blocking downs. We know he can block, but they've always sort of used Darren Waller as the tight end they want to throw to, but now they're doing the same with Foster as well. When you're trying to figure out, like you're looking at a list and you're like, who are my potential top tier fantasy tight ends? Here are the things you want to look for. You want to look for someone who actually has a potential to be in the end zone. We know that we just talked about earlier, tight ends are sometimes sort of touchdown dependent, a semblance of consistency when it comes to targets. And to get those targets, someone who is on the field a lot, a snap share above 80 to 85%. So snap share above 85%, consistent targets, potential for touchdowns. And you kind of get all of that with Foster Moreau. He has been a tight end 12 over the last 4 weeks, and he gives you that fringe tight end 1 or maybe like, borderline tight end 2 conversation. He belongs in that conversation every single week. And with Darren Waller out and Carr maybe finally forming this sort of connection with him, I think he's someone you might be able to add.
All right, we're going to get to our last waiver wire target here, and it's Darius Slayton, wide receiver for the New York Giants. And we thought that Wan'Dale Robinson was going to become the guy, and honestly, all the signs pointed to that. The high draft capital, the Daniel Jones love for the slot receiver, but Darius Slayton has been able to move all over the field, and he's been the guy that's making the big plays. He's getting 6 targets or a touchdown in 4 of his last 5 games, and just the numbers are proving that Darius Slayton is the go-to guy in this offense. He's had 11 or more PPR points in 4 of his last 5 games as well, and over the next 6 weeks, they have a really easy schedule. You're looking at going up against the Detroit Lions, Dallas Cowboys, who that secondary's fallen off a little bit, the Washington Commanders twice, and then the Minnesota Vikings. All of those teams rank near the bottom of the league in terms of defense versus fantasy wide receivers. So this is another guy who we talked about this being the wide receiver week. That is in that wide receiver 3/flex conversation every week now. Now, some honorable mentions I want to talk about before we keep going. Terrace Marshall Jr. for the Panthers, 4 straight weeks with an 86% snap share or higher. It's not sexy, but there's something there. Isaiah McKenzie had his second highest snap share of the season. Isaiah Spiller, yes, I know Isaiah Spiller. It's become a little bit of a handcuff stash. He's now the established RB2 in Los Angeles. So if something happens to Austin Eckler, he's the guy. And then Dontrell Hilliard. This is a name I've been mentioning a lot, man. Derrick Henry keeps going on and off of that injury report. He has not quite looked the same in the games. Dontrell Hilliard, it's handcuff season. Handcuff your running backs, people. Insurance is important. Now, I just want to remind everybody that if you want to watch the show, but you don't always have time to get on YouTube and watch, check out our audio version of this show. We have it on Apple, Spotify, and footballguys.com. The links are all in the description of today's episode here on YouTube, just down below. Take a moment, leave a 5-star review, check us out, all the great content that Football Guys has to offer. Vig, it's time for the Rehab Roundup. It's time for the Rehab Roundup. Big. You were worried if we were going to do the voice? We are. Let's take a look at our first player. He's a Panther, but he's also a man. It's PJ Walker. He's got a high ankle sprain.
Oh, man, folks. Anyone who's been watching football knows that high ankle sprains, they suck. But it does not affect a quarterback in the same way it affects the running back's ability to produce. But PJ Walker is going to be out for 2 to 3 plus weeks at this point. That means Baker Mayfield is going to be your starting quarterback for Carolina. And this Rehab Roundup is really not about PJ Walker. It's really about DJ Moore, because DJ Moore with Baker Mayfield was never, not even once, a top 24 fantasy wide receiver. DJ Moore with PJ Walker had 2 finishes in the top 10. So PJ Walker being out is really more of a cautionary tale for fantasy managers of DJ Moore, who's probably most affected by this injury. So play it by ear, but I don't know. I'm not feeling very comfortable starting DJ Moore, at least until we see what happens with this, revamped version of Baker Mayfield. Maybe he comes back with some more motivation. I actually don't know what's going to happen, but I'm not excited for DJ Moore.
This next one hurts an old man's heart, and it's Cooper Kupp. He's got himself a high ankle sprain.
Man, high ankle sprains, not as bad for quarterbacks, but not great at all for wide receivers. So Cooper Kupp's going to be out for a while. He didn't look like he could put any weight on it. And it might be even worse, right? We still need the MRI. So right now I expect him to be out for 3 to 6 weeks, but let's see what the MRI shows. If there's more, significant ligament damage in there, we may have we might have bigger issues to take care of. But I think overall, the question is, because of Cooper's injury, do I now go and stash or pick, elevate from my stash one of those wide receivers from the Rams? And the answer for me, and you tell me what you think, Alfredo, is no. I do not want any part of that wide receiver core.
I'll give you the long answer. No. Next player on our list here is Zach Ertz, the tight end for the Arizona Cardinals. He hurt his knee.
Oh, the Zach Ertz injury might just be one of the worst things out of the injuries we've talked about so far. The dude was carted off his field. There were some early reports that it might not be the ACL, but the way it looked, it certainly could have had some, major knee ligamentous injury. Either way, it looks like Ertz might be out for a few weeks at bare minimum. Do not be surprised if he lands on the IR. But if Ertz is out, what are we looking at, Alfredo? Is this the beginning of who?
All right, well, I'm not going to do the voice for this one, but I don't know that Trey McBride gives you a whole lot of excitement for redraft, but Dynasty, this could be the start of him taking off. All right, back into character. Our next player here on the Rehab Roundup, I messed up my words, is Jerry Jeudy, also with a high ankle sprain.
Man, I don't know what's going on with the high ankles this past week, but yeah, another high ankle sprain, which means another 3+ weeks out, as many as 5 to 6 even, and another player for whom the MRI will help us. So don't panic on Jerry Jeudy yet, but this kind of makes Courtland Sutton perhaps a bit more interesting, don't you think?
Yeah, I think he's interesting. I'm not quite sure if I'm ready to call him a buy low, but Denver has the 10th easiest strength of schedule for wide receivers, so it gets interesting. Let's take a look at our last player, and it's Khalil Herbert. My boy, he's got a hip injury.
This one really hurts. Yeah, so he was hurt, came out of the game, and was out for the entire game. At this point, don't panic yet. We really don't know much. And not like you were relying on Khalil Herbert to be your end-all, be-all fantasy running back anyway, but he could be out anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks for even longer. What's your sort of outlook based on, what we know right now, at least with Khalil Herbert's injury?
As a Khalil Herbert manager, I'm not very happy about it, but if I'm the David Montgomery manager, you've got a nice, easy matchup coming up in Week 11 against Atlanta, so fire up David Montgomery if you have him. Well, Vigosaurus Rex, that is it for us. Thank you guys so much for watching and listening all the way through. We'll talk to you on Wednesday with Dave Kluge for our Week 11 Trade Targets episode. Adios.
Adios.